What's going on, guys? Christian Hanna Horror here. Today, let's talk about the werewolf films of 1981. So, upon watching In Search of Darkness, which I enjoyed, they talked about these 4 werewolf movies that came out in 1981. Now, were there any more? Possibly, maybe, probably so, but the 4 that they really showed were obviously American Werewolf in London, The Howling, Full Moon High, and Wolfen. And so I had seen 2 of those 4, and you could probably guess which 2. But after seeing that documentary, I made it my life's mission to watch those other 2 wolf films. So let's talk about these 4. I'm not necessarily going to rank them, but I have some things I really want to talk about. So what do you say we do the 2 that I know? And we'll start with possibly the fan favorite of all of them, American Werewolf in London. Now, American Werewolf in London is, I think, arguably one of the best werewolf movies. A lot of people call it the best werewolf movie. And I can't really argue. I mean, it's not going to be my favorite out of these 4. I'll tell you my favorite. But when it comes to American Werewolf, it's hard to argue it. Because, number one, Rick Baker is arguably the greatest werewolf designer ever. I mean, I haven't seen every werewolf movie yet, but, man, the transformation scene in American Werewolf in London is something to be seen. It's horror history. The thing I love about American Werewolf in London is the other elements that it offered. It's not just this werewolf movie. Now, the best friend goes through this crazy zombified transformation throughout the film and really gives it an element that, quite honestly, is my favorite part of the film. Now, American Werewolf in London is an absolute bona fide classic, and I love it. There's not a bad thing I can say about it. I really love American Werewolf in London, and I watch it fairly often. The characters are great, the story is really interesting, and it's just a bona fide smash hit. American Werewolf in London is arguably one of the best werewolf movies ever, and when somebody tells me they think it's the best, I really don't have much of an argument. Next comes from one of my favorite directors, Joseph Dante, and we're talking, of course, about The Howling. Now, The Howling is arguably my favorite werewolf film I've seen up until this point. The Howling is not necessarily going to have as amazing as effects as American Werewolf in London, so you may be asking yourself, why is The Howling my favorite? Well, what I really love about The Howling is really the aesthetic and the mood of the film. It's very spooky. It's much more horror personified in a way. I really like the tone of The Howling. It's very much more of this darker, foreboding horror movie, I guess. I just really like it. They actually brought something up in Search of Darkness that I quite honestly agreed with. Well, nobody denies that Rick Baker is a god and one of the greatest special effects makeup artists ever. Something about the transformation scenes in The Howling really had a great mood with the nice lighting and everything. It was much spookier, as opposed to American Werewolf, which was done in a brightly lit room, which you could argue is even more disturbing. But the aesthetic that they used for The Howling was something that I really liked. I loved the tale. It had this very classic feel to it. I just think that The Howling is amazing. Now, I can't necessarily say I think it's better than American Werewolf in London, but it is my favorite werewolf movie up until this point. I know there's a big debate that gets talked about a lot, The Howling or American Werewolf, and I just think the winner is both, you know. They're both really awesome. I think they're both great films that, whether you pick one or the other between these 2, I don't think either one is ever talked down upon. They're loved by pretty much all horror fans, and I can see why. They're great films. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because these 2 I just recently watched. As I said, Wolfen and Full Moon High were movies I hadn't seen, and I made it my life's mission to check these out immediately. So we'll start with 1981's Full Moon High. Now, this is from Larry Cohen. The Stuff, It's Alive, Cue the Winged Serpent. I love Larry Cohen. He is one of my favorite filmmakers. Now, this film is really interesting because it's not necessarily this brutal, intense horror film at all. Full Moon High is really a comedy. And it's not going to be for everybody, but when I describe this movie, I think it will resonate with some people, especially if you haven't seen it. First and foremost, I loved Full Moon High, pretty much just as much as I love Teen Wolf, which is another werewolf movie I love. I love Teen Wolf. Take Teen Wolf and give it Caddyshack humor, and you've got Full Moon High. Full Moon High stars Alan Arkin, who you may remember him as Jamie Lee Curtis's boyfriend in Halloween H2O, and I always liked that character. I liked his humor in H2O a lot. Quite honestly, the boyfriend in H2O was one of my favorite characters, and when I put on Full Moon High, there's Jamie Lee's boyfriend from H2O as a kid in Full Moon High. Now, Full Moon High is this movie about a football star who gets bit by an actual werewolf in the film and turns into a werewolf. and he's going through all these hijinks, and he's trying to prove to people he's a werewolf, and no one wants to believe him. It's very different in a sense, storyline-wise, from Teen Wolf, but Full Moon High was awesome. I loved it. It's a Larry Cohen film, so most people know what a Larry Cohen film is before you can even see it. It's like David Lynch. David Lynch is his own genre of movies, and I kind of think Larry Cohen could somewhat be considered the same. Full Moon High may not be everybody's cup of tea, because if you're not really into comedy, you may not love this. But if you like comedy, especially Caddyshack, like I said, take Teen Wolf and give it Caddyshack humor, and you've got Full Moon High. Now, the most interesting of the four, I think, that I want to talk about is actually The Wolfen, because The Wolfen was a movie I had not seen, or quite honestly really heard of. I'm sure the name had crossed me on time or two, but I had never seen The Wolfen. So I finally checked out The Wolfen from this Warner Archive Blu-ray. And did I like the film? Yeah. You know, the thing that's interesting about The Wolfen, and this may sound like a real negative, is there's not a whole lot of werewolves in the movie. Quite honestly, there's not a whole lot throughout it, but there are werewolves, don't get me wrong. This isn't like a Howling 5 or 6 in a sense, but Wolfen was a very interesting movie. First of all, the production value and the budget seemed to be fairly good on this movie. It seemed like a well-produced movie, to be quite honest with you. Now, Wolfen is basically a tracking down horror thriller in a sense. It felt like Silence of the Lambs in a sense. Not anything with the subject matter per se, but the traveling style, the moving forward, the going after vibe. That's what you felt like when you're following this guy who's basically trying to track down who is doing all this vicious killing. And honestly, Wolfen was a really good watch, but it's not The Howling, and it's not American Werewolf in London in terms of its intensity and more or less wolves. But is Wolfen worth a watch? I say yeah, because I did like this movie, and I could clearly see myself revisiting it very soon. So, Wolfen is not going to be the big contender out of the four, obviously. There's two that are obviously the big winners, being The Howling and American Werewolf. But going through the 1981 Werewolf movies after seeing the documentary was a really fun thing to do, watching Full Moon High and Wolfen. And these are two movies that I do think are worth your time. Now, if I had to recommend one more so between these two, despite Wolfen being the more legitimate horror film, I'd be lying if I didn't say I love Full Moon High. I thought this would be a fun video to do, talking about the four werewolf films that were the big ones from 1981, so to speak. Now, like I said, I'm sure there may be more somewhere, at least more films that have werewolf elements in it, maybe not so much a full-fledged werewolf movie, but these were the four talked about in that documentary, and I thought this would be a fun video to do. Now, what do you guys think about those four films? What is the winner out of the four for you? Have you checked out the other two, being Full Moon High and Wolfen? If you have, please let me know your thoughts in the comments section below, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. This is Christian Hanna Horror. We'll see you guys next time.